Okay, so welcome everyone. We're very, very happy to have another webinar promoted by SALTISE. We're very happy to have you here with us. And this is the part one of a two-part webinar. So today, the title for today's webinar is the Teamwork Challenge Part 1, Forming Effective Student Groups. Welcome again. And Phoebe?
All right. Hi, everyone. And yes, like Sue said, welcome. It's nice to see everyone here from all kinds of places. I'm going to share my screen. We do have slides today. I will attempt to turn the slides off when possible so you can see people's faces from time to time. All right, do you see the slides? Are we good? Okay, yes. Excellent. Okay, so Sue already introduced the title. We don't need that. A brief overview of what we're going to be looking at today. After my very quick intro, we're going to get right into some of the research on group formation from Purdue University with Matt Oland and from Harvard University with Kelly Miller. Following that, we're going to have Sydney and Michael from McGill University and John Abbott College, respectively, present some case studies from their own practice. Then we're going to have all of these people, except Matt, because he unfortunately has another commitment, a prior commitment at 3 o'clock, discuss some questions as a panel. And lastly, we're going to have a question and answer session. But if you at any point during this webinar have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or to raise your hand. And if I'm talking and I don't notice, someone just let me know, and ditto if it's happening during another speaker.
No.
So I think that if you're here, you probably don't need to be told why group work is important, but I'm going to do it anyway, just very quickly. For starters, group work as a skill, collaborating and communicating is important, not just in school, but in the real world. It's been shown to increase learning when done well of what you're actually teaching, and also how to support students to be more engaged members of whatever discipline you're working in. So that idea of helping students engage in identity work. It's also, with our new online reality, it's important that our students have a chance to interact with each other and see each other and not just sit there and listen to us. There's more reasons than that, but that's a very quick overview for you. We can discuss more if you like. Okay, so when we started planning this webinar, we very quickly realized that group work is such a massive topic that we were going to need to break it up, because 90 minutes is not enough to get into the details on all of group work. So today we're focusing on the formation of groups, and then in a month from now, on March 26th, we'll be doing part 2, which will be looking at more the managing of groups or the orchestration and the idea of peer evaluations and how do you assess group works. So this diagram can help us think about how we make decisions about group formation. We use our pedagogy, our understandings of theory and our best practices to decide what and how we're going to teach. So things like the activities we're going to do and the assessments we're going to use. For most of us here, our pedagogy is going to lead us to decide to use group work in some way in our classes, which then we're going to have to orchestrate. And by orchestrate, I mean everything that we as teachers do in the moment to enact our activity or our lesson. And then, of course, when planning how to orchestrate an activity, we need to consider how we're going to form our groups. So throughout all of this, the decisions about how we're going to form our groups are all constrained and contextualized with also the considerations of who our students are, which is not the same for all of us, and what our curriculum requires. So before our experts delve into their research and their understandings of group formation, I'll list a few questions that we probably all share. So a main concern about forming groups is who is in each group. That also begs the question of Who forms the groups? Should the teacher form the groups? Should we let our students form their own groups? Maybe it should be random. And how many students in each group? And what about the diversity of groups? Is it better to aim for homogeneous groups or heterogeneous groups? And when we talk about homo and heterogeneous, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about academic ability, interests, age, gender? We also probably want to know how long we should keep our groups before we should change them. Do we keep them for the whole semester or do we change them every class? And a few more questions you may want to keep in mind. What effects do our decisions about group formation have on student learning, as well as on our ability to manage our classes? These are not necessarily the same thing. How do we address the impact of the various formation options on racialized and minoritized students? And through all of this, how do we support students with special needs? So I would say most of us are making our groups the best of our ability, but it's still quite ad hoc. It would be really great if we can use evidence-based practices when forming our groups. So without further ado, here are some people that are actually doing research into group formation and how to make effective groups. We're going to start with Matt Oland from Purdue University. Oh, you may have just seen a survey pop up. It just popped up for me. We'd appreciate it if you would quickly fill it out. So Matt, it's over to you.
Great, thanks. There's a lot of opportunity still in research on the strategies for forming teams, which really the research is generally based on team composition, right? So it's we can have various criteria for forming teams, but what really matters is what we end up with, and then how the parameters of the actual formed teams affects various outcomes. So there are certain things that are fairly clear from a lot of research. Self-selection has benefits, and it has some pretty significant drawbacks. It does improve cohesion, but which makes students get along better, especially in a social sense. But it does so at the expense of diversity. Especially, it's risky when students don't know each other. If students don't know each other and their abilities, and they're allowed to self-select, the only criteria they have for self-selection is appearance. And when students do that, they tend to pick to be on teams with students who, quote, look like them, whatever that means to them, because they assume that they'll work better with those folks. So I see the results that just popped up for the poll. So we will be talking about CATME shortly, so you'll know a little bit more about what it does. But once we have teams and they have students who are in whatever context you're working in, who are outnumbered typically in your overall population, so they are at risk of being minoritized, of being marginalized in their team experiences, the general strategy is not to outnumber them. And the idea here is not that they are weak in their team skills or anything, but that the behavior of the majority population changes when they are faced with being in a team with students who are different from them, but also not able to be marginalized because there are more of them. And so probably the most important criterion is that they not be isolated. And the second best option is that they not be outnumbered. But you notice there, I say that students need an explanation. So if students look around the room and they notice, for example, that racial minorities are sort of grouped into a smaller fraction of teams, they can conclude that that is because they are weak in some way and need a support group, if you will. And so it's important, at Purdue, when we teach students and put them in teams this way, we tell them that the goal is to change the behavior of the majority population, even if those behaviors that we're trying to control are sort of, even if they're not aware of them, right? That they tend to interrupt and not consider the opinions of people who are different. And then the one that usually generates also a lot of discussion is about academic ability. So the research is fairly clear, going all the way back to people like Vygotsky and sort of that the notion of learning best when there are people around you who are slightly better at things than you. That it's best to mix academic ability for better learning. However, some people, for various reasons, create a situation where various outcomes, including grades, are dependent upon teams competing against other teams. It's very common in management classes, for example, for teams to compete against each other in strategy exercises. If that kind of condition exists, it's absolutely appropriate and probably for fairness necessary that people be grouped with people of similar ability under those circumstances. So let's pop over to the next slide. The CAPME system, through a tool called TeamMaker, takes advantage of the fact that instructor criteria formed teams have a lot of advantages. It actually uses instructor specific criteria, and what it does with those is it uses all of those criteria and weights that you assign to create a score, and it's trying to optimize that score, which essentially is a measure of how well the teams that are formed fit the criteria that you provide. And the algorithm it uses to do that actually it optimizes the fit of the worst fitting team. In practice, what that means is it will never create a terrible team that doesn't fit your criteria just because it optimizes the overall average. And that's important, right? We don't want to sacrifice a group of students just to make the average experience better. There is published evidence that the system applies an instructor's criteria better than the instructor, and we've had an experienced instructor compete against the algorithm, and the algorithm is better and more consistent than the experienced instructor in that regard. And I'll show a picture in a moment. The way that the weights are implemented, it allows you to, on various criteria, to group similar or dissimilar, and when it comes to minoritized populations, to either avoid outnumbering or to distribute. And importantly, by being able to set weights, you can also actually treat a variable as random. So let's go ahead and hit the next slide. So this is what the interface looks like. And I know Phoebe mentioned the idea of team size. So team size is, the research is also clear that there's no optimum team size, except that when you get more than 6, things get a little bit weird because the dynamics tend to get a lot more complicated if teams are larger than 6. But other than that, the most important thing is that teams be of sufficient size and skill set to do whatever you ask them to do. But we recognize also in the system that sometimes team size is controlled by, for example, classroom geometry or technology. And so as a result, you can set either a minimum or a maximum, and the system will form teams according to that guideline. So what you see in the picture is it's showing a summary of various criteria, including, you can see it will form teams that have similar schedules so that they can meet outside of class. That's also consistent with research that face-to-face interaction and the ability to use nonverbal cues as well is critical to teams developing into high-performing teams. When it comes to the weighting, and this is particularly important for people who form ad hoc teams and want them to continue to work with new people. If you set all of those, to ignore because you're using teams, for example, during class time, it'll continue to reform teams randomly according to all those criteria, which particularly, and we'll go ahead to the next slide. The system has the ability to intentionally separate students, especially if you let them indicate students they don't want to work with. You can intentionally join students, and you can intentionally create teams that have zero overlap with previous teams. And so that's where the random criteria come into play. Because if you're forming teams according to a set of criteria that aren't random, then what'll happen is if you continue to form teams so that they don't have overlap, it'll oscillate between two best conditions back and forth, right? Because each time that it tries to form teams that don't have overlap, it'll go back to the previous set of best fit teams. The system does allow you to create your own questions, such as at Ohio State, they form teams by residence hall. And we can also, Purdue uses schedule compatibility, but does it across lots of time zones as well. So that's really, that's been great during the pandemic. So I think I'll leave it there as far as what it can do. I see that in the chat, I have shared some references related to research findings, and I believe that they're in my bio on the webinar website.
Thanks, Matt. There's also references as the final slide of this presentation, which either has been shared with you or will be shared with you. I'm not sure which of those is most accurate, but you'll get it. We have time to take a few questions from Matt, for Matt. You know what? I'll actually unscreen share for a minute while I have the opportunity.
Great, thanks.
There we go.
Oh, and someone is looking for the link to the webinar website.
Yes, it's going to be shared with all the attendees. Go ahead, Michael.
There's the unmute button. I'm sorry, I got getting too used to Teams. There's my lower hand. Yeah, just very quickly, in terms of the mixed versus similar slide, I was just wondering, when you say similar within, are you meaning similar within the team, or similar teams across the? I get tripped up on the language a little bit around homogeneous and heterogeneous, and I was just wondering if we could clarify.
Sure. Yeah. So this the criterion is applied on a team by team basis. So if you say group similar, it's trying to make on whatever criterion, it's trying to make people within a team similar according to that criterion. And that's why you'll notice, for example, the schedule one only allows grouping similar. It would be pathologically inappropriate to intentionally form teams that couldn't see each other.
Okay, thank you.
Jean-François?
Hi, thanks. This is super interesting. I have a very somewhat boring practical question for you, though. I noticed that you had stuff about GPA and schedule in the criteria that you have. Are these self-reported by the students, or you actually have this embedded in the university or college system?
Great question. So schedule is typically self-reported, especially because student schedules can be very variable according to them setting up a work schedule. But it is possible actually for any question, it is possible to set that question up where if you have the data, you can upload the data. So it can work either way. The way that questions like GPA work is if you're forming teams of 4, for example, the system will separate them into quantiles. And so then if you're trying to form teams that are similar, it'll try and put teams together that are all in the same quantile. And if you're forming teams that are heterogeneous, right, teams that are dissimilar, it'll try and pick one student from each quantile to put in a team.
Thank you.
There are a couple of hands raised. Just go right ahead. I think it's Anis and then Jackie.
Sorry. Hi, thank you for the presentation. It looks like an interesting tool. I was wondering if there is a way to factor in student preferences in the decision. I mean, maybe some students know they work well together, but still the teacher forms the groups, but take into account some student preferences?
So yeah, so this there depends on what kind of preferences you want to use. So if it's preferences regarding which students they'd like to work with,
Yes.
typically people gather that information. So I did that this semester actually, where I collected, I allowed students to indicate actually up to 2 students that they would prefer to work with, and then I allowed them to indicate up to 1 student that they would not want to work with. I was really pleased that actually none of my students had a student on their list they didn't want to work with. That made it easier. But once you have that information, it would be up to you to sort of figure out how to use it, right? So you could, if you wanted to allow students to be paired together on a team, for example, you'd have to put that in as a rule in the system. We do have some in the larger context, people, especially for example, with capstone courses, really had a strong preference for the system to include project preference. And the system now has that feature as well. So you can put in a list of projects and students can indicate their preference for which project to work on, and it will consider that, that ranking in the team formation process.
Thank you.
Jackie, you're next.
Go ahead. Yeah. Hi, Matt. Thanks for that overview. It looks really interesting. I would love to use a tool like this. I'm thinking of the privacy concerns. I think as it is now hosted where you are, I would not be permitted to use it at my institution. So does your licensing allow for local installations, or is the code open source, or how do people deal with that?
So we have a third solution. So it's not open source, and it's not and we don't do institutional installations, although we might be convinced to do that at some point. But instead, what we use is Amazon World Services allows us to operate an instantiation of the code within Canada, so that the data never leaves the country.
Great, thanks.
We're there. Yeah, we definitely had to make sure we had a solution for that, both for for Canada, for GDPR, and then for Australia has similar requirements.
Are there any Canadian institutions using it right now? I should.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Website. Great.
So I can actually I could provide that later. I could provide a list to make sure that it's current, but absolutely. And actually, you're going to hear from one today because Sydney is using it.
Awesome. Thank you.
I don't see any more hands. And I don't see anything in the chat. And I think the timing is absolutely perfect for you, Matt, so you can make it to your next event.
Great. And I'll certainly take, if more questions come up later, just, send me the questions and I'll provide solutions.
Oh, Liz, look at her.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Matt, tremendously. He accepted an invitation at a very late date, and and made room in his schedule to be here. And I think so we're very appreciative. In addition to that, I think it's really important work that we're trying to get here. We know, unlike the US, we are not as diverse ethnically as you are, but I think the information that you're pulling out, extracting with your research on that notion of minoritized populations and group work is extremely important. So I encourage everyone to look at your work and your findings in order to help form your groups. And I think it's really appropriate because it is Black History Month, and I was particularly happy that you would be able to talk about that topic. So thank you again.
Thanks. Great.
Yes.
And I'll send you all the account of sort of where it's currently being used in Canada.
That would be great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very, very much. All right, I'm going to screen share again. And our next expert is Kelly Miller from Harvard University. So In a sec, you'll see the slides. There we go. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. So I'm actually just going to follow up on CATME and talk about some research. I've been using CATME in a class that I've been teaching at Harvard for the past, I've been teaching the class for 7 years, but we started using CATME about 4 years ago. And so I'm going to describe just a little bit of context of the class, and then I'll show how we use CATME a little bit, and then some of the research that we're doing. And a lot of the research that we're doing is it's brand new. And so I would love as many questions or any feedback that you might have about the data would be really helpful. So I've been teaching this class called Applied Physics 50. It is a large team-based physics class for engineering students. The students are organized into teams of 4 or 5 for each of 3 projects that occur over the course of the semester. So there's like 3 one-month-long projects. We organize the students into teams. We don't let them self-select. I'll explain how we do that in a second. We don't actually use the team selection mode of CATME only because when we first started using CATME, that was not very well developed, that feature in the software. We were interested in the software for its ability to administer peer assessment. So we had developed already a Python algorithm that we continue to use to form the teams, but the algorithm behind our team formation is almost identical, it sounds like, to what Matt just described. In any case, so we organize students into 3 groupings over the course of the semester. At the end of each grouping, at the end of each project, we have them evaluate the 4 or the 3 or 4 other people on their team, and then we release that feedback, and then we reorganize them for the next project into a new student team. So we have a lot of data that we've accumulated, and we've been analyzing some of it. And so that what I'm going to show you is based on 2 semesters worth of data from the CATME system. So how we make teams, because this is an active area of research, we're doing a lot of experimentation. So we're not sort of making the same types of teams every single time. We're interested in sort of like how, if we change the composition of a team in one sort of grouping, how does that affect the overall sort of team experience for students and also team performance? And I'll show you some of those data at the end. But these are the types of inputs that we use. So similar to like what Matt was just describing, we use gender. We have them do a pre-semester survey, have them fill out like the force concept inventory in the fall, and the CSEM in the spring, so that we have an idea of how much physics they're coming into the semester with. As we collect more data over the course of the semester, we use that data for subsequent like groupings. So we'll use like exam number 1 to make group number 2. And then we always make it so that the students are never working with people that they've worked with on a previous team experience. So we use like their input, their previous team number as an input. And then we've also done some experimentation with having them fill out some surveys that give us an indication of what kind of learning style preferences they have. And we've done some experimentations with like heterogeneous versus homogeneous teams and how those perform and what kind of experiences they have. And then we also use the course that I teach, the student population, half of them are pre-medical students and half of them are on the engineering track. And so we use that variable as well to try and diversify the teams. So if you go to the next slide. So in terms of the data that we've been analyzing, so CATME, I don't think Matt mentioned this, but the rating scale it's a behavioral anchored rating scale, which means that the students, when they fill out the evaluation, they're describing behaviors that are typical of various levels of performance in each of 5 different dimensions. And the 5 dimensions I've listed here on the slide. So they have, and I'll show you exactly what it looks like in a second, but they're evaluating each other on how they contribute to the team's work, how they interact, how they keep the team going, how they keep them on track, the level of quality that they expect. And then the last criteria is having related knowledge, skills, and abilities. And this is one that, as physicists, we're particularly interested in because we found that it correlates with sort of course performance, like, you know, the ability to perform well on the exams. And then, so those are the 5 sort of criteria that describe the individual. And then there are these 3 questions that the students have to answer about their sort of overall team experience. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So this, and the words are too tiny for you to read, but this is what the survey looks like from the student perspective. So I made, just for the purposes of illustration, I made a fake team, and I'm a member of the team. So you can see my name, Kelly Miller, is up there at the top. And then you can see that there are 4 other people on my team, right? So I'm a team of 5. And so when I'm answering the survey, I just click through, and each of these radio buttons corresponds to a specific behavior that corresponds to describing those people's contributions to the team's work. Okay, so it's like a very easy, quick survey for them to fill out. And then Phoebe, if you go to the next slide and the next slide and the next slide, these are the different categories. So keeping the team on track, expecting quality, having related knowledge, skills, and so I think we might have skipped one, but you get the idea. So there's 5 of these, and they're just clicking through the buttons, evaluating each other in this way. Okay, and then the next slide shows you the team questions. Okay, so it's quick from the student perspective. It's very quick, and it provides us as the instructors a lot of information about the students' feedback to each other from the point of view of how they work as a team. So if you go to the next slide. So this and then yes, okay. So this is some of the data that we've collected. These are, so actually, Phoebe, if you just click all 4 of them on there, these are 4 plots that show the average rating on the y-axis. So it's out of 5. And this is some of the research that we're doing to try to understand how the raters, who is doing the rating and who is being rated from both a gender and a race and diversity point of view, influences or biases the scores. Okay, and so if we sort of focus on the top left plot, and maybe I can just talk through that, and then it sort of maps onto the rest of them. So this is contributing to the team's work. So that's one of the 5 dimensions that CAPME is measuring. And you can see that there's 4 different averages that we've plotted here. So males rating males, males rating females, females rating males, and females rating females. So, and this is very new, like we're really just making sense of this, but what we're beginning to realize is that these 4 criteria all describe the sort of what I'll describe as like the softer sort of engineering teamwork skills, as opposed to the 5th one, which is the one I sort of flagged at the beginning as we're particularly interested in having knowledge, skills, and expertise. And you'll see in a second when we go to the next slide that pattern is very, very different in terms of the pairing of the rating. So what we notice here is that the females rating females in all 4 categories are that last bar is distinctly like higher than any of the other 3, but the males rating females is not significantly different from males rating males, right? So like if you compare the first 2 bars on each of those 4 plots, there's no statistically significant difference between those 2 bars. But if you go to the next slide, so here we see the same data, but for that 5th dimension, right, which is having related knowledge, skills, and abilities. And here we see that that males rating females is distinctly low, like much lower than, for example, males rating males. Well, than actually all 3 of the other bars. And when we plot the interaction, we noticed a really interesting significant interaction between the gender of the rater and the gender of the ratee. Right, so male students rate female students as having lower ability than other male students, even when we control for actual ability. So the plot on the left, on the bottom left-hand corner, it actually represents a linear regression model where we've plotted the interaction, and we've been able to control for actual competency. So we put into that model how much knowledge, like how well students are doing on the exams, how well they're doing, how well they did on the test coming into the semester. So we're able to control for how much students actually know. So even when you control for that, male students systematically rate female students as having lower sort of level of competency. So this is something, again, like we're just kind of making sense of. If we go to the next slide, we've done the same kind of analysis looking at the race of rater and ratee. So this is exactly the same plot, but instead of male and female, we've got white students and white students versus Black Hispanic students. Okay, and we see like not quite as drastic a difference as with the gender data, but you can see that across, contributing to the team's work, the top left-hand plot, and having related knowledge, skills, and ability, that white students rate Black and Hispanic students systematically lower in those 2 categories. And actually keeping the team on track. So again, this is like very, new data. This is the first time I've ever sort of presented it, and I'm still making sense of it. But that's the reason that we're interested in this is because we're interested in understanding how implicit bias can factor into when you ask students to evaluate one another. And something that I didn't mention, but I should have, is that so we started using CATME 4 years ago. And now every single engineering class at Harvard that has any kind of group work uses CATME. Like all of the courses that do group work in the School of Engineering here use CATME. And so we're very interested to understand, the sort of systematic biases that might exist in this kind of data. But in any sense, so these next few slides are sort of based on some older research that we've done, where we were looking at the team composition, like how the team composition predicts performance and team satisfaction. So the left-hand plot, we did an experiment where we made 2 different types of teams. This is potentially a little bit unethical, but we had teams where the gender was balanced, and then teams where there was one male or female student isolated. And then we compared how those teams performed, like in the sort of deliverables of the team versus what kind of an experience they had. So the performance is on the left, the experience, like how they rated their team experience, is on the right. And so what we found is that gender balanced teams perform slightly better than gender isolated teams, which is consistent with what is in the literature, but they rate their team experience just as high, which we found very surprising. We didn't collect a lot of data on this because we didn't want to have teams where there were gender, where people were isolated in their gender. And so that's why the error bars are so large on the gender isolated bars. Okay, if we go to the next. Okay, so this is the same data, but looking at what I mentioned, the homogeneous versus heterogeneous teams. So this is another experiment we did where we had students fill out a survey that gave them some information on what kind of learning preference they had. That this is something that I could send people information about if they're interested in. It's called 5 Dynamics. It basically categorizes you according to what phase of a project you excel in, whether it's the sort of exploratory brainstorming one or the execution or the analysis. And so we made teams where everybody on the team was the same kind of learning style. And then we made other kinds of teams where everybody was a different learning style. And then we compared them across the same criteria, like performance and rating. And what we found is that, again, teams that are more diverse, so teams where all members have the same learning style, like the homogeneous, they don't perform as well, but they rate their experience just as high. And then if we go to the last slide, the second to last. Okay, so another thing we did was we were very interested. I don't know if any of you read that New York Times article back in 2017 that was talking about the experiment that Google did with looking at, so Google has obviously access to massive amounts of data on teams because all of their employees work in these sort of multifaceted teams. And they wrote an article about what are the predictive factors of highly functioning teams. And they found that the only thing that is predictive of a team performing well is how empathetic the people on the team are to one another. And so we were like intrigued by that article. And so what we did over a couple of semesters is we administered a survey that claimed to measure students' level of empathy. And then we grouped teams where the students had like a higher average empathy versus teams where, you know, we didn't do it purposely. We just took the average of like how empathetic is this team on average compared to this team. Because we couldn't get the IRB to do it purposely. And then the next slide shows what we found with empathy. So we found that the teams that scored higher on average on the empathy metric performed better and rated their experience as better than the low empathy teams, which is again consistent with the literature. So I think that was all I had. I'm happy to answer questions.
There's one question here, Kelly, about, so I know that CAPME does offer like practice sessions. The students can practice evaluating before they actually do it. Did you do that with your data? That was the question, I believe.
We do that, yeah, we do that because we have the same students for the entire year. Like we make 6 different, because the students, it's a 2-semester course. And so the students are working in 6 different teams because 3 per semester. So we have them do that sort of practice rating exercise for the very first team, but not for all the others, because we figure like once they've done it once, they have a sense. And I think that like once you've gone through the CAPME experience once, like that in itself is a rating, you know, like every time you do it, you're practicing. So that you really only have to do it once. But yes, we do have them do that at the very beginning.
Behi, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. I was interested in the results you showed about the like measuring assessment of skill for taking into account gender. So you mentioned that for females, like in general, males rank females, their skills as being lower than they actually are. Can you tell me what, I didn't really get that part, the next part. What about the female ranking of males? Because they were also ranking males lower. When you actually take into account the actual level of skill of the males, was there any kind of correlation there?
Yeah, so yeah, but the important thing there is that the male students aren't rating them, they're not, there's no difference in terms of between how they're rating themselves versus, I mean, if we go back to that, maybe Phoebe, if you can go back to that slide.
Sure, give me a second here.
I guess it's slide, let's see.
I will go back. I believe it's this one.
I think it's 20. Yes, this one. Yeah. So the error bars overlap on the left, right? So like there's no significant difference between how male and female raters are rating males. That's how you interpret like the far left part of the graph. So I mean that's fine. I mean, but on the right hand side, there's a distinct difference. Those bars represent the 95% confidence interval. So the male raters are rating female ratees as significantly lower than female raters are rating them, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, Phoebe, do you want me to, I'm not caught up with the chat.
That's okay. I'm actually not seeing, someone has asked for the Google article on empathy. If you happen to have that.
Yeah, I'll dig that up.
Actually, Patty shared the link to it.
Oh, great, okay.
Thanks, Patty. And also any articles you have on your work. I think you have said it's a work in progress.
Yeah, we haven't actually published any of this. We're working on it. I mean, yeah, it's something that I'm sort of working on now.
And Andre has asked, from the data, was there any explanation for this low rating of males against? I'm assuming it's the male-female thing we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this work, the gender work, actually represents a project that I'm working on with somebody at the Harvard Business School. There's a professor there who's in organizational behavior. And I mean, she knows a lot more than I do about this kind of gender, this whole body of research on like gender dynamics within small groups. But I mean, she says it's just it looks like a classic example of just implicit bias. But I mean, we would need to do interviews and sort of study it further to really know for sure.
Okay, thanks a lot. That'd be actually interesting to follow up on, to see
how
far it can go, and I mean, I'm guessing, I think with Academy software, students have the possibility to add a comment, I guess, in their grades or something like that. And so if in times there's something that sticks out generally that would explain why a student would generally undergrade someone else, a female in that case.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Actually, something that neither Matt nor I mentioned about CATME, and which I think it's one of the most useful aspects about the platform, is there is a at the end of the sort of prescribed questions section, there's an open-ended where students are asked to give anonymous sort of anecdotal feedback on the other members of their team. And one of the things that we want to do but haven't yet is to do some sort of a text analysis of that, like feed that through some sort of like computer text analyzer to see like if there's any interesting information that comes out, like if you look at how, like if it's a female rating a male and vice versa.
Thanks, Kelly. I know that there are more questions because that was just fascinating, I think, for all of us. We're going to move on now to the case studies, but there will be more time. We'll have a panel discussion and open Q&A. So if you have more questions, just save them and ask them near to the end. Thank you again, Kelly. That was much appreciated.
Thanks.
I'm going to share my screen again. I'll just have to flip through quickly. Oh, there we go. Okay, so next we have Sydney Omeland from McGill University, who's going to talk to us about her own work using CATME. Go ahead, Sydney.
Hi, thanks so much for this invitation. I'm happy to talk. I think I have one slide that's, yes. Is there also my points, or you're, I think if you wanted to show the whole slide content.
That's,
oh, there we go. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll tell you quickly who I am. So yes, I am someone who worked in industry and then came to academia to teach and work on new processes for sustainability largely. And I was finding that the group projects weren't very structured as far as how do I put them in groups and what kind of skills are they learning by being part of this group. And so I started to read the literature and the Oakley data, and I tried to put together some feedback forms in Excel for my groups. And this was taking a bazillion years to put together and give them feedback to them from their peers. So I learned about CATME in a conference and was like, well, this exists. Fantastic. I'm sold. So I've been using CATME now for 3 years. I started it, tested it in a technical elective course on a small group of students and asked what they thought. They seemed to like it. So then I brought it into the capstone design course. And I use it both to make the teams and also to have the peer and self-analysis halfway through the course. So there's a chance for for behavior correction, and then at the end of the course. And so, yes, the group formation, I use what you've learned of people giving us the information about each student, and I've made a point of making sure there is no single female on a team. And I've already heard from students who are females to say thank you so much for that, because it makes a big difference. Usually because they become the mom of the group, and they're the naggers, and they're making sure things happen. They're always the minute taker. And when there's 2 women on the group, then they actually find that shifts. It's not like, oh, you're obviously the female to take care of this team's housekeeping. And it's a better dynamic. So confirmed. It's so nice to be able to confirm that doesn't happen with using CATME. I'm so glad to hear, I learned at this webinar that I've also asked the students, is there a student you really don't want to work with? Or the students have a choice. Either you choose a student you really want to work with, or you give me the project. I actually asked them for top 3 interests for projects, because our department is quite diverse. And I find student engagement is better if the student likes the topic that they're working on. So I pull them for the kind of projects they'd like to work on, or areas they'd like to work on: aerospace, biomaterials, mineral processing, have whatever. And then I use CATME to first not strand the females. Second, I distribute for academic ability to make sure it's fairly balanced. Also, our school has a fair number of international students. So I also distribute according to English speaking skills. And also this year it's been super helpful, because I remember the first year I used it, they said, why do they ask for time zones? And I mentioned, well, sometimes you have, I don't know, online learning, maybe it's helpful. And that's been very helpful in the pandemic, because our students are anywhere from Dubai to Korea. So I've grouped them according to time zones, which has been great. And then, yes, I accommodate the interests. So basically I'd use CATME to sort according to male, female, or not disclosing, and academic ability, English skills, time zones. And then I manually go through it. I have less than 60 students per course. So I usually bring in TAs who know the students and say, is this like, do we have any fights that we can avoid? Or does this make sense? And so we work the data and then publish the groups. And then do I have another slide as well? Or was it just
actually no, that was it.
Okay, great. So I use it for team, but do I have another minute? I can't remember. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yes, you have time.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
One thing I want to mention, which has been amazing, is that coming from industry, I found that what I like CATME about so much is that it causes the students to think about these skill sets that were mentioned earlier. Thank you for a great presentation before mine. And I find that just having them go through that evaluation of how do I rank and my peers rank on these skill sets, I notice a difference in how they behave with each other. because it's almost like giving a scaffolding of the kind of behavioral traits that good engineering teams have. So I was like jumping for joy when I did the test myself. I was like, these are all the things, yes, that make a team a good team or not a good team in industry or in undergrad, wherever you are. So I really appreciate it for it being like a self-teaching, self-reflecting exercise for the students. And I find using it twice is very helpful because sometimes students really aren't aware of the impact they have on others because of whatever reason. And when they see this feedback halfway through a project, they have a chance to reflect. And then at the end, they have a chance to see if there's a change. So anecdotally, I know that students, it was mentioned by before, that students can give comments anonymously. You can also make them not anonymous. After you give the points, you can just make a comment. And I've made that not anonymous. And students a few have always said, I don't want to write anything because it's not anonymous. So I make a point of explaining to the students that it's important to know how to give constructive criticism to anyone on a team in your future. And here's a good place to practice. So knowing that some students just didn't put in comments because they didn't feel comfortable writing what they wanted to say. But then they've always invariably come back and said, wow, it was really helpful. And can I please give the comment now? Can I go back and do it? So I find that it really terrifies students at first, but I always go through the comments to make sure that they're reasonable, and they really are. So I find that that ability to give some feedback halfway through this portal helps students change during a semester. And last point I want to make is a student did get back to me with a course feedback saying that he was that student that was dysfunctional and learned it through using CATME in a course. And then he used it in a second course. All the skills he learned in the course before, he used in the next year. He said, I was the one who helped make the group a better group because of what I had learned through that forced interaction with these metrics of these qualities. So I find a lot of engineering professors don't have a lot of experience working in teams normally. And I really appreciate CATME giving structure to these skills. And then the students interact with that on their own. And that's what I wanted to say. And I'm open for questions.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, we have time for probably one question. I can't actually, you know what, I can't see hands up. So if there's a hand up, can somebody?
I'm also open if people want to email me later.
Well, I'm going to ask a question, Phoebe. So this is Maria from McGill.
Great, thank you.
And if anyone, or Sydney, or maybe if someone wants to write in the chat, has experienced complaint from students of their, what is it called, EDI information being asked. So if someone says, oh, but why do you want to know my gender? How is that going to play against me? And I know some professors have received those type of comments that, so I want to know, Sydney, has been the case for you?
Yeah, so I've been asked why, and my answer is because I don't want to strand one student of one gender in a group. And in fact, one year I had a group where all the interests were around fabrics, and there was one man. So I always check to make sure there's not just one female in a group. And then one year I had to take him aside. I'm like, normally it's the woman I'm worried about, but are you okay working on a group with all women? And he's like, yeah, it's fine. So when I tell them it's to avoid that, then they seem to be okay. They're like, that's fine. And that's what happens. So it works well.
It's actually something Matt brought up too in his presentation, this idea of the choices we make, especially the visible choices, need to be explained to the students so they don't jump to conclusions that are incorrect and also damaging.
Yes.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, that we do sometimes get questions from students about why we collect all of this data, and we tell them we're completely transparent that we're interested in making better groups and in having in doing whatever needs to be done to make sure that they have the best group experience possible, and that based on research that we've done, like we found that this is what's required to make sure that the groups are optimized, and they seem to buy that and be okay with it.
Thank you very much, Sydney.
Great.
That was very interesting, and I think again it's got us all thinking of new ideas and things to try. Our last presenter today is Michael Dugdale from John Abbott College. Michael, you can go ahead. After this, we're going to have our panel talk about a few ideas, and you'll also have a chance to ask those questions that I'm sure you all have.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll go through this as you know, quickly as I can. Just my case study involves I teach physics at the college level. I don't have any TAs, and my classes are about 80 minutes in length. The group work I typically do are group problems, solving problems in groups on boards around the room, and they are not graded. But as in order to get groups of 4 to 5 students, I'm typically looking on the order of 10 to 12 groups. And when Phoebe, if you could advance, thank you. At 10 to 12 groups, that's meaning about 7 to 8 minutes of contact time that I would have them if we did the whole class as group work. So that means these groups have got to be working on average independently for 7 to 8 minutes if I distribute my time sort of equally amongst the groups. So this was a bit of an orchestrational challenge for me, and I've sort of moved towards the using homogeneous groups, and I'll explain why as we go. The challenges here are preventing, what I'm really trying to avoid are having sort of work come to a crashing halt in any individual group. And I'm really looking out for supporting students who need that support from me. So that's, that's sort of my motivation there. So as I was saying, I sort of focus on formation of homogeneous groups, and that I think that falls a little bit differently than some of my some of the previous speakers, although their points are all very, very well taken. But in my context, if my groups are really similar to each other in having a diversity of skill levels, then I would really need to devote my time sort of equally amongst them. And again, that creates a very limited amount of time. There's intragroup dynamics that I've observed, and with the strong students sometimes taking over out of frustration of waiting for the teacher, and they take over and leave everybody else behind. And that's sort of another situation that I want to avoid. And there's also that complication of a teacher group interaction. And if you think of it, if I'm dealing with a group of students who are sort of similar to one another, you don't have to spend as much time making connections between the other members of the group. And I talk about it here as if you could run the risk of having if we want to quote Vygotsky, we could have a non-aligned zones of proximal development, and that means you sort of have to address the students within the group separately. So, and these are all sort of experiences that I've had and that have given me orchestrational challenges in the past. So yeah. So I've decided to start looking, and this was on the advice of a colleague of mine who pointed me to some literature on formation of homogeneous groups. The idea here is by sort of having the groups be similar within the group but different amongst each other, that I could devote more of my time in supporting the groups that need the support the most. There's the notion that the students being a little bit closer to each other, they might be speaking the same language. Another feature that I like is at times the stronger groups will have finished with the exercises before anybody else. And at that point, I could give them something more interesting to do, but I can also recruit them to act as TAs and help out with the other groups. So this is some of the pros. Some of the things that are constraints of this approach, though, is that can't really use this in an evaluation context because the groups are unbalanced by design. I do two-stage exams, but the grouping is different for those. And in fact, the grouping is sort of geographical. Whoever's desks are nearby, that will be a group for the exam. So that's left a little bit more to the students to self-organize in that context. And also the group part of the two-stage exam is not exceptionally challenging, and nor does it count for a lot of grades. So I'm really focusing on sort of the day-to-day, here are some problems, let's work some problems, a couple of very easy introductory problems, some exam style problems, and some deeper ones. And I've been working with, again, these homogeneous groups for the last few years. Can we go to the next slide? So how I've done this is, basically to apparently reinvent elements of CAPME, and as they say, you can reinvent it, but badly. But it's a little bit of a homegrown solution where I'm taking information about students from surveys and diagnostics in that first week of class. This is before I know the students. I do get to know them as we go through the semester, but really I don't know really much about them. Typically, I'll have them do the force concept inventory if they're coming into a mechanics course. I'll often ask to self-report prior grades if they're comfortable sharing that. One semester, I didn't really have anything else to do, so I used the cognitive reflection test. There's another side to it as well, and it's the epistemic, what I call the epistemic dimension, and that is students' understanding of science and what science is about, as well as their roles as students of science and the relationship, how what is an equation for in physics and that. And a couple of instruments that I've used, it's the CLASS, the Colorado Learning Attitudes About Science Survey, and the VASP, which is Views About Science Survey in Physics. These sorts of instruments exist in other contexts as well. So I'm most familiar with the physics, of course. Okay.
Michael, there was a quick question from Chris about where the VASP instrument comes from.
Where it comes from, on my hard drive, I got it. I did get it as a package of instruments that are used in teaching. I think it was called Teaching with the Physics Suite, which somebody gifted to me when I started teaching it.
It's okay, Mike. It's okay, Mike. I'm finding it right now. If I find it, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So how to form the groups? Basically, I take these data, and this is where, I don't have a fancy Python script, and I really don't have CAPME, but I'm trying to achieve sort of something similar in terms of automating the grouping of the students from the data. And so what I do is a process of dimensional reduction. By that, I mean, you could use something like singular value decomposition or, whatever fancy way you like it, but take all these bits of data and sort of squeeze them down to 2 dimensions. Then, once they're in this 2-dimensional space, you cluster them, and then I correct for imbalances. And that, the term gender isolation has come up. That's one of the imbalances I'm really looking for, and to fix. And so I'll move students from one group to another to sort of correct that. Just to say, I'm dealing with small numbers. I'm typically looking at keeping groups in the lab structure. So I'm picking 5 to 6 groups out of 20 students. So we're not sort of getting the edges of that axis. In reality, I'm really working, a little bit closer to the center. But I have, the thing I have noticed is that the groups really do form their own character, and that identity emerges very quickly. And it's really cool as a teacher that you are seeing that identity. Sometimes you've got students grouping together because they're taking physics strategically because that's what they need to graduate to go into law school. Whereas I have other groups who, really have a love of physics itself. So, what I say is I very quickly forget about how the groups were formed and just let the groups, once that's happening, engage and and let that identity sort of come out. I definitely make use of the public space in the classroom. From my point of view, from orchestrational point of view, I can monitor what's happening and take action as I need it a little bit more, but it also provides opportunity of cross-pollination between the groups. And again, these are ungraded, no evaluation is being done in this context. So the cross-pollination I view as a positive. And the other thing, I'll just say, I don't use it for evaluation because the groups are by design unbalanced. And it's always good to have a few bonus tasks around because sometimes the really high performing groups will race through an exercise. So there we go. That's my, that's what I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. As we're not exactly nearing 4 o'clock yet, but we're getting there. So I think we will move on to a discussion combined with a question and answer. Liz brought up this idea of the difference between students working together for the purpose of learning versus the purpose of being assessed. So, and also, I guess that also the distinction of if they're doing a formative task versus a summative task and how that changes how we should form our groups. Perhaps we can start there with the panel. The panel, by the way, if you're not sure if you're on the panel, it's Kelly, Michael, and Sydney. Do you guys have anything you might contribute to that?
I mean, I think that CAPME can be used for both, right? The implementation that I described in Applied Physics 50, we definitely use it as a way for providing feedback to students so that they can use that information about their behavior, or at least other team members' perceptions of their behavior in the next time they're grouped together in a team. And then we also use it as information, for assessing their teamwork skills and how those skills are progressing over the course of the semester. So I think it's a great tool for, it depends on how you have it set up. I'm also teaching a course this semester, an engineering course, where we are using CAPME. The students are grouped in one consistent team that is the same team for the entire semester. And we have them fill the survey out a few times over the course of the semester where we say the data, it's not going to count. It's just to give a formative assessment. And then we're going to have them do it once at the end. And then it's the one at the end that counts. So I think that's another way you can use it, right? You can say, provide, like feedback where the students are just learning from it, and then have like the very last kind of culminating one be the one that actually contributes to the grade.
There's a question here about has anyone included, I guess maybe this is about CAPME, but however we collect data and then use it to form groups, gender, non-binary and or trans students, has that been included? Is Harvard doing that?
We haven't come across that. I mean, there definitely are students that don't identify and are non-binary. We haven't included that. We're analyzing sort of older data, and so that hasn't come up in our data sets. But I mean, in terms of grouping, it actually hasn't. That's a really good question. I don't know. I don't know how we've dealt with that. I mean, I think we've just sort of, so this past semester is the only semester that I can think of where there was a student who was non-binary, and I didn't teach last semester, so I'll have to ask Eric Mazur how he dealt with that. That's a great question. I don't know.
I had my first non-binary this semester, and I grouped as a female, just thinking as non-binary, I assumed that probably more a female type classification than male type, for the sense of being at a disadvantage. So I
Okay,
paired a
yeah.
non-binary with a female. So I mean, it's an assumption I made, because I also was like, oh, what do I do with non-binary? And so I assumed
Yeah.
would be the disadvantaged group, like females.
I mean, I guess maybe just asking the student, you know, what they would like. Yeah, I'm not sure what if other people have opinions on this.
It also, I mean, adds that question and that tension we're seeing, especially with Michael's presentation, his case study, is that our contexts of our students are all very different, and the things we have to deal with. And a lot of people were talking earlier on the chat, you know, things like, I have this experience in physics of sports class I teach. I don't have enough females to not isolate females. Or that would be the case, I would assume, with a non-gender, non-binary student or a trans student, is you can't not isolate them. So what do we do? What are our options? And you just suggested one, which is speaking to the individual about this and trying to find a solution with them. I wonder if you guys can also contribute to that discussion.
I'll say my classes are sufficiently small, and when that's the case, I've had I have had a case where that was, and it was, you know, a conversation with a student, and how would you best identify, and you know, how would you like me to treat this? And yeah, it was not an issue. And again, I'm not dealing with 300 students at a time. It's perhaps a little bit easier in my context for that.
I don't know if there are any people with hands up, because I can't see that, but
It's not. Go ahead.
So, no, I'd like to sort of go back to the more broad question of assessment versus learning. No, are there different ways, and you know, and can we think about it? I was really interested in Sydney, the fact that, or maybe with Sydney and Kelly, the fact that you were doing this sort of projects, like they were longer term projects, whereas Michael is really short, you know, very, you know, so there, in other words, there are many variables that are maybe at play here. And that would be really nice to hear a little bit more about your thinking there.
Sure, yes. So I can start by saying I know a colleague who used CATME once and told the students the assessment would be used for their final grade. And he said it was a disaster, because the students, it makes it more complex because they know this grade. So I told the students from the very beginning, I will not use your peer assessments in grading at all, and I don't. But what I do is I have the CATME data that's still recorded, and I ask the students to create Gantt charts for every report they give. So I have recording of who did what for each report, and they usually correlate. You know, the slackers in the Gantt chart are the slackers in CATME. And then at the end of the semester, I make an adjustment where I see, say, one student's worked so hard and the others have not. I will boost that student's grade, knowing that if they had other better students, their final report would be better. I never hear from those students. And from students who I know have not done much of the work, I lower their grade, and they contact me and say, the grade I see is not the grade I got. And I was like, let's have a conversation. And we have the conversation, and they accept my decision, because I say, like, I asked them about what they learned, I asked them what they did, and I said, do you really think you deserve the grade that everyone else earned for you? And I was like, so when you have that one-on-one conversation, I've never had a problem after that, because I just asked them, I'm like, really, I see what you've done and you're not going to win. And then it's fine. But what I like doing now is having that halfway assessment where I can warn the student, right? So I don't wait till the end. So I forgot to mention that. Now that I do this like halfway thing, I was talking about my previous life when I didn't have CATME. With CATME at the halfway point, I send out the warning shot, and I say, unless you start participating, you realize your grade will be lower. And then luckily there aren't that many students who have that situation, but at least I've warned them. So they can't say, oh, I didn't know I wasn't participating like I was supposed to, which they all say, even though it's obvious. Sorry, do groups make a Gantt chart? Yes, so the answer is each group is responsible for making a Gantt chart for the work done for that report. And I encourage them to say, like, who did the work, who edited, you know, who checked the calculation. I'm like, please give yourself credit for the work you are doing in this. And the students love it. I'm not kidding. They're like, they're so thankful that they can say, this is who did what, and this is who worked. They love it. There's never been a problem. They love doing it. And I use that more than I use this CATME assessment. So I feel like I've given them freedom to just tell people through this structure of this software how you think it's going with them on the team. And I think the ACE is just giving them time to get to know each other first. Because one year I did it too early, and they said, oh, we don't really know each other enough to answer these questions well. So I pushed it back until they had a few assignments submitted. Then I give it, and then I give it at the end. And so you can see, like, it's wonderful to see students say, like, wow, you really got better. Thank you so much. Like, it's a really great chance for students to change their behavior in a professional way. So I'm a huge fan.
Susan from the University of Toronto just mentioned that she does something similar to Sydney's approach using an attribution report, and that you use a slightly different tool. Susan, do you have a few minutes just to share that with us?
Sure. So, hi, Sydney.
Hi, Susan. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. So yes, in our design, first year design course that I teach, we use what's called an attribution table, which is very, very similar to what Sydney is talking about. It breaks down all of the sections in the report, and then it has all the different kinds of tasks that would go into each section, the research, the writing, the editing or drafting, all of those things. And it's basically set up as a 2x2 table with student names of who's on the team, and students fill this out and they all have to sign it before they submit their report. And generally speaking, everybody on the team gets the same grade unless we see one person who has much less of a contribution, and we will have a team meeting with the team just to confirm this, and then it impacts that person's grade. But otherwise and we sometimes have students who say, well, if I did way more than everyone else on the team, don't I get a higher grade? And the answer is no. By hijacking your team, you do not get a higher grade for hijacking your team. But that has worked very well. We've been using it for over a decade now in team reports. And in the last couple of years, we've started using a feedback mechanism, formative feedback to teams partway through the term, 2 or 3 times during the term. It's called TELS, which stands for Team Effectiveness Learning System, I think. It was developed by Patricia Sheridan at the University of Toronto as part of her PhD, and there's publications on it. And it has a similar kind of feedback inventory, similar to CATME, and it produces a radio chart that gets fed back to students, and it has learning modules associated with the different things in the inventory. So if students get a really low score in one of the parts of the inventory, they can go in and learn what that part of the inventory means.
Great. And shout out to Susan. I was a teaching assistant when she was building her amazing first year course. So
she told us at the beginning before you got here.
Yeah, I was like, where's Sydney?
Teaching, sorry.
Thank you very much, Susan. That's really interesting. Maybe we're almost out of time. And before I forget, I am going to get one more conversation going, I hope. But before I forget, there is a form we would really like you to all fill out, just giving us some feedback on this webinar so we can continue to provide events that are useful and effective. Is the link's in the chat, but perhaps it should be reposted to the chat. Sue or Janaea, if you could do that so it appears at the bottom.
Yes, 1 second.
You don't have to do it this very minute. We're not quite done, but so it's there and we don't forget. I'll try to mention again at the very end. I just thought, again, related to what everyone's been talking about and what Liz brought back up a few minutes ago, maybe it would be worth talking for just a few minutes about how our choices should be different depending on what we're doing with our students. So Liz, I think that's what you were getting at too. Like when we're doing a short-term activity that's not for grades, or maybe is for grades, versus a whole semester long project where there's going to be a grade at the end. And I'm not talking about the pure assessment grades, I'm talking about the actual product that the students come out with, whether it's a test or a project. It's going to be graded and they're all going to receive that grade, whether or not it's modified by their contributions. Should we be making different choices about how we form our groups depending on what we're asking them to do? It's a big question for 3 minutes.
I'll venture just one little thought is that it's not just whether it's graded or not, it's how much support you have in the classroom, what your context is. I moved towards the idea of homogeneous groups because I was doing a bad job of managing sort of fairly balanced groups. And I recognized that, and this was a manner that I adopted to address that. I certainly would reconsider, don't know if I'd make a different choice, but I'd reconsider it if I had 2 or 3 TAs to help me out. It would be a different context and a different problem and a sort of a different optimization at that point on my point.
I think I would say for this question that it's contextual. So for example, if it's really a good one, right? Because I definitely, sometimes you're tempted to put the dream team together and the problem students together and have them, fight it out or just rise to the challenge and have a great experience. So part of me thinks that's, it is more educational to work with a diverse group of people, no matter what, because as I was taught by my first year professors, you never get to choose who you work with ever. So we're going to, because every team we had through all our group projects undergrad, there was always dysfunction, and we weren't a large class. So we asked our professors, why'd you do that to us? And they said, well, we want you to learn how to work with people you don't like, because that's what happens at work. And I've never forgotten, or I've always appreciated that lesson. So my point is, I tell the students ahead of time, like we talked about earlier, if you tell them why you're doing something. So I make a point of telling them, I'm not putting you with your friends because once you leave, you'll never get to work with friends unless you start your own company, and then you'll all hate each other after a year of working together. So let's not go there. But anyways, I just make sure I tell them why. And with that, they've never complained about like, why am I not working with my friend? It'd be better if, like, yes, it would, but we want you to practice these skills here. And I tell them, you'll see this type of people everywhere, every job you go, you're going to have these different types of people on your team. So get used to what it's like to work with this kind of person and the skills you should have with you to manage that person on your team and manage yourself with that person on the team in the future. So I'm actually kind of siding with dysfunction at all times. But as you say, like contextualize with support.
It's 4 o'clock by my clock anyway.
Go. Thank you. I gotta go.
I do see, no, sorry, I should say, thank you, Sydney. Oh, did she disappear? She has to go, doesn't she, at 4? Well, it's good for her to know then. I see a few interesting questions here, one from Benjamin. We can take these questions and we can continue the conversation on March 26th, for which I hope you all join us. Has the feedback been posted in the chat? I haven't seen the link to the form.
Yes, but say it again, please, Janaea.
Maybe just one more time. It can be hard to scroll up in the Zoom chat for some reason.
I'll send a few times.
Thank you so much to our presenters for taking the time to join and share with us your experience and your expertise. And thank you to everyone for coming today on a Friday afternoon, and for some of us just before the study break. So it's lovely to see you all, and have a nice weekend.
And thank you very much, Phoebe, for keeping us moving. And
yeah, thank you on behalf of SALTISE and the SALTISE team, Sue and Janaea and Boyana and Chow, and we really appreciate your work, Phoebe, on making this a very, very productive webinar, and encourage everyone to come on back. If anyone wants to have a quick question, and if anybody's still around, because I can't see who's still around, we can definitely sort of do the one last question. It's the round of applause. It's bringing back the for the curtain call. So anyone has one last question that they desperately want to have answered by one of the members? Is Kelly still here? I can't tell anymore.
Yes.
Yep, I am.
Hi, Kelly. Yeah. So anyone, so this is
There was a question. I don't know if Benjamin's still here. I mean, officially.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, I can't.
That's
My
okay.
computer's frozen to the extent where I can't scroll up in the chat anymore. Perhaps you could repeat your question.
Yeah, of course. So I'm running group work for the very first time in a slightly advanced math course. So I've scrapped tests altogether, and I'm asking them to do group assignments on a weekly basis. I allowed them at the start of the semester to choose their groups if they wished. A lot of the students didn't know anybody, and I assigned them at random. So a number of groups were working very well, had great systems in place, and others were not working well whatsoever. And so after 3 weeks, I switched them up, and I'm planning to switch them every 3 weeks. And obviously the groups that worked very well gave me some significant pushback. Do you really have to break us up? This is all working so well for us, and it's the best part of the semester so far, and blah, blah. And the students who were pulling their group members along, saying, I can't get in touch with people, they're not doing their share, they were begging me to switch things around. So I'm curious, for those of you who have more experience, how do you balance those student desires, and how do you find that sweet spot of consistency versus the learning gains that come from interacting with more students?
Well, so I actually think that the comment that Sydney just made, I agree with everything that she said, in that it's important to recognize that having students work with diverse groups and having, sort of forcing them to interact with people that they might not, work easily with, assuming that is one of the learning objectives of the course, or of like your reason for having them work in groups in the first place, which I'm assuming that is one of the reasons. I think just being really clear, and I think allowing them to choose their groups, while it might make them happy, I think it sends a mixed message, because it almost implies that you're willing to have them work like in whatever group arrangement they want. And so what happens with us is, after the first group project, so we assign them all the groups, and after the first group project, they a lot, I would say more than half of the groups like begged to be able to stay for the second project. And we explain, like, no, that's not how it works. Like, we have this system, we're going to reshuffle you. And like every single time we're going to reshuffle you, regardless of, like, we want you to have the experience of working with lots of different people over the course of the semester. That's part of the objective. So I think just being really clear, like, with what your goals are, and explaining to them the rationale for those goals, I think, and also I think if you're providing some mechanism for them to give feedback to each other, it doesn't have to be cat me. It could be like, something really, really simple like Google Forms, and whether you use that information for actual assessment or not, I think having a mechanism where they can give each other feedback, and that's essential, because otherwise you do have students who just like ride on the coattails of others. So that feedback mechanism, I think, is essential, even if you have no intention of using it for assessment.
I'm going to implement. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
No, I just wanted to say that what I think is so critical about this particular webinar is that there are factors, more than anything else, that there are factors that can be used to determine, group formation, and those factors can then be probably examined when we do the questioning of, like, why people might want to stay together or not stay together, and see and understand it better, because I think your point, Kelly, is really well made. Like, what's the purpose of the learning? So one of the things that we've seen in active learning classrooms is that, you want to get a sense of identity amongst the groups, and without having the data that Kelly has, we were going very much on, what it felt like, these people were working together really well. And so we didn't want to break it up. And would we change the dynamic? But if we have better understanding of what those factors are, we could then say, if we do change them, we won't break up the sense of identity, which is what I was observing, was that the tables, and you're familiar with the active learning classroom, so each table had an identity, and that identity formation was critical for their learning, because they were getting confident that they could do things and talk to each other within that small group. So, so now we have better, ways of looking at it, by collecting those things that you're talking about, Kelly.
We might also want to consider, like Ben, you're asking about every 3 weeks, how often is appropriate, and how much are we asking of our students when we change them? It's not the same request for every student. For some students, it's not a big deal. They get comfortable fairly easily, and for other students, especially students with particular disabilities who struggle in group work as it is, and we're requiring that they work in these groups, it might be asking too much to take them from a group that they've actually invested themselves in, and have to do it all over again 3 weeks or even a month later.
Right.
Which I know doesn't answer your question at all. No, just makes it harder.
That's fine. I mean, that's exactly the thing that I'm trying to balance. I can find really strong arguments for keeping a group together for the whole time, especially in the current context. I mean, Liz was talking about the active learning classroom, and there's no physical space to anchor that around right now. And so there's no, students are not being drawn to a particular classroom. So in my group work sessions, students might just not show up. So the students who didn't want to be broken up, it was both groups that I'd asked to work together, as well as groups who had been assigned randomly, and they didn't want to be broken up because they had found their virtual table. They had figured out a process that worked really well. And so, yeah, like really what I'm struggling with is that balance, because that worked really well for some groups. And do you reward that, or do you say, well, there's also value in starting over with a new group that you don't know, because that emulates a real life work experience? And that's, it's my first time running through all of this, and so this is where I'm particularly stuck right now.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this as part of like an the work that they're producing is evaluated.
A significant portion of the course,
and that adds a wrinkle in the how the students are perceiving the evaluation, that they're, this is, I'm not doing well because of just because of my group, and that can sort of generate a negative affect around the course and what and what they're learning, and that I guess so that is a complication. And I'm just hearing though about the working in groups in the workplace, and I think that's important. But what it really is, in your case, in math class, in my case of physics class, and the primary is developing the competencies in those and if the group structure is interfering in some cases, you might want to, I wouldn't hesitate. But again, I don't really use it for evaluation, so it's easy for me to say. But I wouldn't hesitate mixing up a group that was dysfunctional, because I'm just there to. I want them to learn, and if the group is getting in the way of learning, well, okay, I'll change that around. And conversely, if the group is really functioning well, great. Let's try and arrange the other groups in a way that will work. That will sort of try to bring them to that level. But but again, it's a complication when there's a significant evaluation associated with it. And I'm not sure, are you teaching at the college level or at the university?
I'm at Dawson College.
At Dawson. So I mean, you know, you've got I don't know if they call it the same thing, but the IPESA and sort of the college policy on student evaluations, you know, and that is can be a bit of a complication as well.
I know Lee has a really good point, and Phoebe, that the way you just said is. It's one of the things that I tried to do when I split up the groups, and I split up everybody, even the groups that were working well, is I asked them to fill out a form on Google Forms and gave them the opportunity to tell me to name the people from their group that they would like to be paired with if possible. And so they were all working in groups of 4, and as much as possible I tried to take 2 people who worked in one group and match them with 2 people who worked in another group, so at least there was some anchor of consistency and they could share what worked well from their previous groups. And I think for some groups that's worked well, but I mean, we just shuffled everything this week, so I don't really know yet.
Liz? Yeah, just to add to Kelly's workload, I think maybe this would be, you know, these kinds of questions could be ones that you add, because you probably have one of the largest data sources of people who are looking at this topic closely. You know, you, Matt, as researchers trying to understand what it is that we can and cannot do with groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from our point of view, like one thing that we cannot do is we cannot have the groups be uneven in terms of like background knowledge. So like that's, I mean, in the algorithm that I described that we use, that is the #1 sort of criterion that is that goes into forming the teams, is the students' performance on the tests that we have, the background physics test that we have them take before they, like at the beginning of the semester, because everything they're doing is in groups, and all of the, I mean, not just the team assessment part of it, but like all of the kind of deliverables are like a product of the group's effort. So it would be completely unfair. And the students, especially here, they're so like grade driven that they would go completely like nuts if, you know, if they perceived any kind of inequity in terms of like one like rock star team versus a team of people that like, so I don't know. I mean, yeah, that's one thing that like we know we can't mess with, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking more in to Benjamin's point of you know, keeping teams together over the longer period of time. You know, I think maybe this is this kind of research, because again, going back to my earlier point, I think the fact that you're doing this research and Matt is doing this kind of research, and CATME and your software are identifying these, you know, the key factors that are making differences. That to me is really a giant step forward in team formation, because it's been too long that we've been working on this as just being our gut feeling. You know, this is what we think, and you know, and sometimes it works beautifully, and then sometimes there are disasters, and we have no idea what we've done. And I think that's the thing, is that, you know, there's no sense of you know, there's no learning that, you know, as the community learning about what we did right and what we did wrong. And we always, you know, and yet, you know, active learning is so dependent on group work. You know, it is the cornerstone of a definition of active learning, is that kind of group work and collaboration. And yet we're doing it on you know, intuition.
Right.
Yeah. Michael has his hand up, and Phoebe had to leave, so maybe we should probably Sue, at least we should stop recording, and you know, and maybe have Michael have the last word so that those of you who need to go can go home.